Hello, dear friends, it's Drake again. This story takes us to yet another country where a horrifying crime unfolds. Welcome to the vast and vibrant Brazil, with a population of just over 200 million people. This country amazes with its scale by all standards, making it one of the most diverse places on Earth. Now, our attention shifts to the metropolis of Sao Paulo. Currently the most densely populated city in Brazil, it serves as the economic heart of the country with numerous cultural institutions. Every year, over $200 billion pass through the city, and more than 4,500 families in Sao Paulo are classified as millionaires. This brings us to the Von Richthofen family, extremely wealthy and living in the suburbs of Sao Paulo. Their small family mansion located south of the city in the neighborhood of Brooklyn is valued at $3 million Brazilian dollars. Along with numerous living rooms and bedrooms, the residence even boasts a pool, an office, and an extensive library. The entrance to the mansion consists of massive gates, and the perimeter is protected from the outside world by a high brick fence with decorative masonry and exotic plants. The founders of this residence were the Von Richthofen family, led by the father, Manfred, a talented German engineer and the director of a major company managing highways and roads leading to Sao Paulo. His wife Mauricia was a Brazilian by origin and worked as a local psychiatrist. The couple met when Manfred was studying civil engineering at the University of Sao Paulo, and as they say, it was love at first sight. Mauricia's outgoing and friendly demeanor complemented Manfred's quiet and gentle nature. Eventually they got married and started thinking about having children. In 1983, the couple welcomed their first child, a daughter named Susan, and 4 years later, her younger brother Andreas was born. The two children grew up in an affluent family, attending the most elite private schools in the city, and as a result, they were highly educated. Speaking of Susan, she could be described as a quiet young girl who often kept to herself due to her shyness. She wasn't a leader among the children, but Susan had a few friends. She was also an obedient daughter to her parents and got along well with her brother. As she grew older, Susan learned 3 languages, and after graduating from a German high school, she continued studying law at the University of Sao Paulo. If Susan succeeded in studying law, she would have been a more law-abiding citizen. Despite her aspirations for a successful and professional future, Susan didn't really need to worry about money, as her parents were very wealthy. The Von Richthofen family's fortune amounted to about $17 million. According to unverified data, Susan's father had about 10 million euros in an account in a Swiss bank, an account that was fortunately planned to be passed on to her once she completed her education. Having had a carefree childhood, excellent education, and 10 million euros in the bank, Susan could only wait and be a good daughter in person. As the summer of 2002 approached, the dynamics between Susan and her parents began to change. Susan, now 18, started to think more about love than finances. In 1999, the family visited an aircraft model exhibition, sparking Andreas's interest in modeling. While at the exhibition, he met and struck up a conversation with a guy named Daniel Kravenhos. At the time, Daniel was 19 and skilled in model building. With growing passion, Andreas requested his parents to pay Daniel to teach him the intricacies of modeling. The parents approved, and during Andreas's training, Daniel unexpectedly caught the attention of Susan, Andreas's sister. Although some sources claim that Daniel and Susan met in kickboxing classes, this is untrue, as they already knew each other for a couple of months by the time they attended those classes. From the beginning, Daniel and Susan got along well, with some saying that opposites attract, and this was a perfect example. Susan came from a wealthy, well-educated family, while Daniel had a completely different upbringing, coming from an underprivileged and troubled family. Expelled from college for poor performance, Daniel, along with his older brother Christian, earned a living by doing repairs in a local garage. Susan, a well-groomed young girl from a cultured background, found Daniel's rebellious behavior unusual and intriguing. His scruffy appearance fascinated her, but unsure of how her parents would react to her relationship with Daniel, Susan decided to keep it a secret. However, As time passed, her parents learned that their daughter was dating the guy who came to teach Andreas. Initially unconcerned, her parents even allowed the meetings as Daniel claimed to be a law school student building model airplanes. Eventually, her parents discovered that Daniel wasn't enrolled anywhere, smoked daily, and consumed alcohol. Knowing that all parents want the best for their children, Manfred and Maricia, hardworking and wealthy individuals, couldn't accept that their daughter was involved with someone like Daniel. However, the young couple had their unwitting ally and defender, Andreas. Adoring his sister and seeing a good friend in Daniel, Andreas often concealed their meetings. While the two enjoyed themselves in motels or spent time at Daniel's house, Andreas came up with elaborate schemes and excuses to shield and justify his sister, deflecting their parents' anger. Fatefully, Manfred and Maricia went on a month-long vacation to Europe, leaving Susan and Andreas with full freedom in the house. Since Susan was 18, she had an excellent opportunity to prove her maturity to her parents. Instead, she secretly invited Daniel to stay in their home, where they spent the entire month by the pool, drinking and experimenting with various prohibited substances. Upon their return, the parents learned how their daughter spent her time in their absence. Over the next few weeks, there were disputes and arguments in the family, and after them, Susan became more and more determined. One day, she declared that her father could buy her and Daniel an apartment where the couple could live happily ever after. Of course, her father said no. Moreover, he said she could do whatever she wanted, but with her own money. And to these words, Manfred added the threat to cut off Susan's financial support. The girl became furious, but eventually she resigned herself to her defeat, or at least pretended to, as she continued to secretly meet with Daniel. What these two started planning was truly dreadful. On the 1st of November in 2002, early in the morning, the streets in the area around the residence where the Von Richthofen family lived were filled with frantic screams. These screams of horror emanated from the family home because what the children discovered was shocking. Both Susan and Andreas had left the house the night before, but when they returned around 4 a.m., they witnessed a horrific scene. Their mother and father, Maricia and Manfred, were dead, and the police officers who arrived at the scene found the bodies of the spouses in their own bedroom. They had been brutally attacked while they slept, and judging by the items in the room, more than one method of murder was used. Maricia and Manfred were beaten almost beyond recognition. Marks of strangulation were visible on his neck, and a trash bag covered the woman's head. It all looked as if the family had been robbed. Money was taken from a suitcase lying nearby, and from other places where apparently they were hidden. However, something didn't add up when officers began examining the property, rooms, and the office more thoroughly. For instance, the alarm system failed to alert the guards who were across the road at the time. Upon closer inspection, the alarm was found to be disabled, indicating that the killers must have known the code. Moreover, the police-searched house seemed too tidy for a crime scene. All documents and papers were scattered in a seemingly even manner, not as a robber in haste would scatter them, and the list of inconsistencies and irregularities continued. There were no signs of forced entry, no electronic devices were stolen, and some rooms were not even entered, remaining untouched. What happened to the family, no one knew, and various speculations were made. The media, of course, focused their attention on Susan and Andreas, and as reported, Manfred and Maricia's son was so distraught that he could hardly breathe. While Susan was also supposed to be grieving for her parents' death, she looked remarkably calm. During police interviews, it was revealed that the brother and sister spent the evening away from home. It turned out that on October 31st at 9 p.m., Susan took her 15-year-old brother out of the house to attend a party at an internet cafe without informing her parents, who thought their son was sleeping at home. After dropping her brother off near the cafe, Susan rented a hotel room and warned Daniel that they could meet, try some substances, and have fun. However, by the early morning at 4 a.m., the brother and sister quietly returned home before their parents started getting ready for work and found them murdered in bed. Here, investigators began to have doubts. Susan's statements contradicted those of her brother Andreas because, unlike him, Susan indicated that her parents supported her relationship with Daniel, which, as we know, was a lie. On November 1st, 2002, the Von Richthofen spouses were buried. Relatives, colleagues, and of course, the media attended the farewell ceremony. It was noted that Susan hardly cried during the funeral, unlike her brother. The girl's satisfied, unrestrained behavior raised suspicions. Rumors began to circulate that Susan had thrown a party at her home by the pool just 3 days after her parents were killed. In addition to this, it was noted how quickly her emotions shifted from grief during the funeral to joyous laughter during the poolside revelry. All of this raised significant suspicion among authorities. What particularly alarmed them was a substantial tip-off. Someone reported to the police about a suspicious purchase made by Daniel's brother, Christian Kravenhaus. The purchase of a Suzuki motorcycle itself couldn't be deemed suspicious, but the fact that it was made at a local store just a few days after the murders occurred raised eyebrows. Christian, who was 26, paid for everything in cash, using large bills. This aroused suspicion because those who knew Daniel and Christian were aware that these guys were in dire financial straits. They had no steady jobs and were involved in alcohol and illegal substance use. Acting on the received information, officers brought Christian to the local police station, where he was rigorously interrogated. Despite his seemingly unapproachable demeanor and claims of innocence, Christian eventually confessed to the murder of Manfred and Mauricia. What's worse, it was revealed that Daniel and Susan helped him in this crime. According to Christian, Susan and his brother conspired to murder their parents so that they could finally live together. Furthermore, they planned to inherit the $17 million that would be left after their parents' death. The police immediately tracked down these two and began questioning them. Daniel shared his version of events, but his statements differed from what Susan had said. The girl claimed that money was not the primary motive. However, her boyfriend stated that significant money played a crucial role in his agreement to the crime. Despite their deep love for each other, they broke up almost immediately after the arrest. Although Susan was initially taken into custody, she was later released from prison pending trial, which did not commence for almost 4 years. While free, she was not heavily restricted in her actions and almost took control of the inheritance, interacting with lawyers. She also agreed to interviews with local media. During the recording, the girl cried, blamed everything on Daniel, and claimed that he had ruined her family. In the interview, Susan portrayed herself as a distraught and broken young girl who ended up in an unfortunate story due to her naivety. This performance, most likely aimed at improving her image, had the opposite effect. Lacking acting skills, Susan couldn't convince people of her innocence and victimhood. On July 17, 2006, Susan, Daniel, and Christian stood before the court, facing charges of first-degree murder. The jury was presented with very detailed information about what happened on Halloween, October 31, 2002. So, on the late evening of October 31st, Mauricia and Manfred were fast asleep. It was a Thursday, and they had spent most of the day at work. At 9 p.m., Andreas left home with Susan, but his intentions were innocent enough for a 15-year-old boy. He just wanted to attend an online party. However, Susan had different, quite serious and horrifying plans. She returned home in her car with Daniel and Christian after dropping her brother off at the internet cafe. Even though the family's security guard noticed her, he wasn't alarmed. Susan checked on her parents to make sure they were asleep, and upon realizing that everything was quiet, she deactivated the home alarm. She then led the men into the living room, where they put on surgical gloves, donned hoods, and headed upstairs to the parents' bedroom with iron bars in hand. At that time, Susan sat on the luxurious sofa and turned on the television. Finding Mauricia and Manfred asleep, the two brothers began assaulting the couple. Despite immense pain, the man and woman resisted, unwilling to die. They fought back. Desiring to quickly finish the task at hand, the brothers resorted to using towels found in the bathroom. This ended Manfred's life, but Mauricia was still alive. Daniel found a plastic bag and callously pulled it over the woman's head, tightening it ruthlessly. After a few minutes, Mauricia stopped breathing. Once this was done, the trio staged a robbery, scattering several papers in the office and stealing all the money they could find. Then all three left the house. To establish alibis, Christian went to a fast food restaurant, making sure he was seen. Meanwhile, Daniel and Susan spent time at a hotel, indulging in pleasures, and later requested the bill as proof of their presence. At 3:30 a.m., Susan picked up Andreas from the party, returned to the family home, and pretended to be shocked upon discovering the horrifying scene. During the court proceedings, Susan blamed everything on Daniel, claiming that he constantly drugged her with some unknown substances, using her sedated state to coerce her into agreeing to murder. On the other hand, the Blood brothers did not assert that they acted based on Susan's desires and plans. They also stated that they were protecting a girl who suffered from alcoholic parents, abusive towards her. It's worth mentioning that forensic analysis refuted all these claims. There was no alcohol found in Susan's parents' blood. Moreover, Susan failed to inspire trust, and the prosecutor branded her as the mastermind behind the crime. Susan was described as the perfect embodiment of an evil blonde, and the conclusion was drawn that all she wanted was to acquire the money and assets for which her parents had worked so hard. She desired freedom and independence. On July 22, 2006, just 5 days after the start of the trial, Susan, Daniel, and Christian were convicted of the murders of Manfred and Mauricia. Prosecutors demanded 50 years behind bars, but unfortunately none of the three received such a sentence. In the end, Susan and Daniel were sentenced to 40 years of imprisonment, while Christian was sentenced to 38 years for conspiracy. As expected from someone as defiant as Susan, she attempted several times to mitigate and overturn her sentence. For example, in 2018, she sought freedom, citing a personality disorder that led her to commit the crime. Of course, her request was denied. Unfortunately, there were several tragic turns of events later on. For instance, Susan's brother Andreas never fully recovered from the death of his parents. In 2017, 3 neighbors were awakened in the middle of the night and found that their house had been broken into. A man lay on the floor. When the police arrived, he began claiming that he hadn't committed any violence. He was deeply frightened, saying he didn't care about his life. This man was Andreas. He roamed the streets with a family relic in his hands, and his legs were covered in scars. Shortly after, he was hospitalized in a special facility. The family home became vacant. In 2014, it was sold to unknown buyers who painted the entire facade white. Many in this story sympathize with Andreas. He had an excellent education and a bright future ahead. He had loving parents, but in an instant, he lost it all. His sister suddenly found herself behind bars, and his mother and father were dead. It's no wonder the guy plunged into the darkest corners of his mind. And although he was hospitalized, it is unclear how his life unfolded afterward. Despite murdering her parents, Susan will most likely inherit their money after serving her prison term. This means that with a 40-year sentence, she will be released around 2042 and will be a multi-millionaire. Even now, Susan and Daniel's sentences are being carried out in a semi-open regime. This means that they are allowed to leave the prison on special holidays and even for vacations. What's worse, Susan has already been seen at parties during conditional release. Apparently in Brazil, prisoners who have committed murders get leave. Thanks for watching. I recommend checking out other videos on my channel. Click now. Don't forget to hit the bell and subscribe to my channel.